Today I'm going to be changing the rear brake pads for a 2018 Subaru Outback. For this, I'm going to be using a jack stand, lug nut wrench, and to finish off a torque wrench. Now for the brakes. I did have to use a breaker bar. The pistons on the caliper do need to be pushed back in, but on the rear they actually are twisted. And so I have this, what's called a caliper cube, and it actually helps take care of that. And grab yourself an extension to use this. You can get away not using the cube, just use needle nose pliers, fit them on the notches that the cube would go on, and just turn. It takes longer, but it's doable. There'll still be a little bit you need to push in, so I use this. It will compress the rest of the piston inwards. It's a good tool to have, especially if you always do your brakes. You can use a C-clamp. Just be aware on the Outback there is a plastic portion on the rear of the caliper. Flathead screwdriver or a set of needle nose pliers to remove the bracket that's right there. 14 millimeter socket with ratchet and extension if needed. Brake cleaner and lube. Use any lube you want, doesn't matter. The brake pads I'm going to be using are Duralast Elites. The model is right there, DE1808. If you're going to be saving yourself money by doing the brakes yourself, might as well get some good set of pads. Make sure your vehicle's in park, release the parking brake, and make sure your tires are chalked. Open your hood, clean the top of your brake fluid reservoir, and then open it. Place a paper towel or a rag over the reservoir to prevent any dust or dirt getting in. Starting on the driver's side, break the 19 millimeter lug nuts loose while the vehicle is still on the ground. Use a jack to raise the vehicle at the jack points and secure it on a jack stand. With the wheel off the ground, go ahead and remove the lug nuts and get the tire out of the way. Going to replace the front and rear brake pads, the brackets, and make sure your rotors are smooth. The electronic brake motor is in the back, and there's a little clip on the bottom end to remove. We're going to start by disconnecting the plug from the electronic parking brake. You can either push through the rubber cover or pull the rubber cover down and push the clip right there. Needle nose pliers do help if it's a little stuck. Using a 14 millimeter socket, you're going to remove two bolts, one at the top and one at the bottom. I did have to use a breaker bar to get these things loose. I like to start with the bottom bolt first to prevent the caliper from falling and yanking on the brake line. Remove the top bolt next, and while you're doing this, ensure that you are supporting the bottom of the caliper in the event that gravity decides to drop it to the ground. Shimmy that bad boy off. With the brake caliper off, you want to make sure there's no tension on the brake line, so you can either hook it up right there onto the spring or just set it in a way you know it's not going to fall. Just watch out for that little plastic portion right there so it doesn't break. With your flathead screwdriver, go ahead and pop that bracket off. You should be able to easily push the brake pads out of the caliper now. I like to keep the pads sandwiched together when set off to the side so I remember which one was on the rear and which one was on the front. Check your old pads for even wear. Clean your caliper. You can use a wire brush if you want. How clean you get it is really up to you. At the minimum, ensure that the contact points where the caliper and the piston meet the back of the brake pads are clean and smooth. Part of the caliper is held together by two guide rods, which can easily be removed if you need more workspace. Just pull this piece straight up. Using the caliper cube attached to a 3/8 extension, you're going to turn the piston clockwise. which will push the piston back into the caliper. This will allow more space to fit in the new brake pads, which are thicker than the old ones. If you don't have the caliper cube, you can do this with needle nose pliers as well. It does take longer, and you have to be very careful not to let the pliers slip and rip the rubber boot around the piston. As the piston retracts, it's going to force brake fluid back into the brake line and towards the brake fluid reservoir, which is why I removed the reservoir cap in the beginning to avoid excess pressure in the lines. If your reservoir was already full before this point, check it to ensure that it doesn't overflow as you push the piston in. Conversely, you can open the bleeder valve near the caliper while pushing the piston in to release excess brake fluid. It's something I never do, but it is an option. Once you can't turn the piston anymore, stop and don't try to force it any further. Turning the piston doesn't completely press the piston back into the caliper, so I'm going to use one of the old brake pads set against the piston and my caliper tool to press the last remaining bit of the piston back in. You can do this with a C-clamp, you just have to be very careful not to crack the plastic housing of the electronic parking mechanism. The only accessible metal part on the back of the caliper for the C-clamp will cause the clamp to be used at an angle, which may or may not cause damage to the piston. If you're always changing your own brakes yourself, just invest the $10 on this little tool. It's so much easier and you won't regret it. Push the piston in slowly, don't rush it. Same when you're using the caliper cube and turning the piston in. If you push the brake fluid in too fast and too hard, you can possibly cause damage to the brake lines, piston boot, or create bubbles in the system. Check the piston boot for any leaks and ensure the piston is flat and straight. Put the caliper back together if you took it apart. Just align the guide rods and push it in. Ensure the guide rods are clean and there shouldn't be any resistance going in. If it doesn't feel smooth, just wipe the guide rods clean and add a little grease. In the box, you're going to find a small bag with new brackets, an extra set of these spring clips that go on the pads that are on the inboard part of the calipers. The new brake pads already have the clips attached, but it's always nice to have extra parts just in case. The box comes with two sets of brake pads, driver's and passenger side. I like to lay them out to match them next to the old ones to ensure that I'm using the correct brake pads on the correct side of the vehicle and that they actually match. As you can see, the squealer bar is positioned differently depending on whether it's the right side or the left side of the vehicle. Using the lube or grease of your choice, apply a thin layer on the contact points, which are where the caliper contacts the pads. I also put a thin layer on the back plate of the pad, which I know some criticize me for, but I have been changing the brakes on my vehicles for years and have never had any brake squeal, pad seizing on calipers, or any problems at all. It's what I do. You guys can do your own research on that and make your own choice. Just use a thin layer and do not get any lube or grease on the contact patch that actually meets with the rotors. After lubing up your pads, it's time to place them back in the caliper. Starting with the inboard pad, the brake pad should just pop right in. You'll see that the spring clip on the long end of the pad helps keep tension as the pad sits in the caliper. After that, just put on the outboard pad. Attach a new bracket to the caliper. While doing this, you're going to want to hold the outboard brake pad against the caliper to prevent it from falling out of place. The pad will stay in place once the bracket is on. This step can be done with the caliper attached to the rotor if you don't want to hold the pad, but you lose the ability to move the caliper around if you need to. I like to start by attaching the bottom end first, then use the needle nose pliers to get the top end in place. Slide the caliper back onto the rotor, ensuring that the mounting points are lined up so you can put the bolts back in. Double check that your brake line isn't twisted or damaged. Start by inserting the top bolt first so you don't have to keep holding the caliper. Tighten by hand first to ensure you don't cause damage by crossing the threads. Do the bottom bolt next. Granted, you can do this with a socket. Just be careful, don't cross the threads. Reattach the power to the electronic parking brake and make sure the rubber cover is also in place. I'm tightening the bolts by feel, and you should probably torque it to spec. Double, triple check your work, slap the tire back on, lug nuts, torque those down, and I'm going to show a quick clip of me doing the passenger side. Glad that's over. Check your reservoir fluid, top off if needed, clean the reservoir, clean the cap, and replace the cap. This part is very important. Pump your brakes multiple times until they are stiff and won't pump any further. You'll notice the first time you step on the brakes, the pedal will easily fall all the way down to the floor. You don't want to find that out while you're driving. You may have heard that you cannot do the rear brakes on a newer Subaru or at least the Outback without connecting a computer to the OBD2 port. All the computer really does is help retract the piston automatically so you don't have to manually twist it back in by hand. And it places the vehicle in ready to replace pads mode. I'll show you that my check engine light is not on and the parking brake works. And you'll just have to trust me that I recorded this last part after completing the brake job. Thank you guys, and I hope you enjoyed.